sound yesterday. She doesn't realize it yet, but she was doing what we call juking, and I'll explain that later. As soon as the music came on, she was moving. So, tell your friends you were juking. Annie, Tyann, everyone who's been a part of facilitating this, dynamic symposium. Everybody has been great. Community members, presenters, right? I love teaching, but I'm happy to have been here for the last 2 days instead of teaching. But again, thank you for choosing me for the keynote. I hope to honor your choice, and I'm sure this was coming, but this is long overdue. I do want to express my sincerest gratitude to Nancy just for all that she's done over the years, right? And she knows this, but she probably recognized my potential as a burgeoning scholar activist before I did myself, right? And so equity is giving folks an opportunity, and one way to do that is to reach back, and her hands are always behind her back, right? And so I'm grateful to anyone who just goes out of their way to help me understand my positionality as a Black woman in this world, how to be strategic about navigating this world, about elevating, or for anybody who elevates the experiences and the voices of Black women as intentionally as you do, Nancy. And the Black community might pull me to the side after this, but sometimes I forget she's a white woman. That is until she calls me hey, you want to train for a 10K? And I'm like, no, nobody just run for no reason with nobody behind us.
It's a half marathon, not a 10K.
Right, and it's still too long. Nobody's chasing us. No. So you're definitely invited to the cookout. You know that. I sincerely thank you for your mentorship over the years. I also appreciate the support from just friends and colleagues and sorority sisters and former students and mentees, especially Isan and Violet. They belong to y'all right now, but like I told Nancy earlier, I'll be happy to take them back. In the last couple of years, right, I've been fortunate to learn about Dayton's history and culture from my friend and colleague, Fahim, the swaggy historian. I just admitted that. Actually, I don't even know if he remembers. We were running sprints one day at a park in Dayton, and he was really pissed off that we were running sprints. I later learned. But in between sets, he's telling me about Western history of Western civilization, and then he starts talking about redlining in Dayton, and that's when I realized that Dayton was really similar to Chicago. I've admired the work that Carlos is doing in Springfield. I've been connected to the work that Deja Dimmons is doing with Dayton Young Black Professionals. But I've lived in Trotwood, almost a decade, and as a transplant resident, if I'm being honest, I identified myself as a Chicagoan only. That is until I got connected to the community. And likewise, this symposium is also a reminder of the fact that the personal isn't just political, the personal is historical, right? What I realize is that I've just migrated from one racially inequitable system to another, right? That's the handiwork of the same ugly monster, right? So the symposium is a merger of the two worlds in which I exist. We've heard from both scholars and community voices, both equally important and mutually reinforcing. And so what I'm presenting today is on belonging and home place, right? But here's the gag: I often feel like I'm in search of my own home place, right? Because again, I live in Chicago, my research is in Chicago. I say I live in Chicago, I kind of still do. But I also live in Dayton, and my job is in Cincinnati. So, I'm somewhat of a nomad, right? But this discursive space has felt like home, and primarily because the narratives are eerily similar, right? And because I think the organizers have done an exceptional job of curating such a communal space with a communal ethos, right? It's circular, right? There are no hierarchies, and I just had a conversation earlier with Miss Henrietta here, and it's interesting because we were talking about the dilapidation of high-rise public housing, and here I am trying to think of the argument that Rothstein made in The Color of the Law. And she's like, yeah, no, that's not how that happened. But who am I going to listen to? I'm going to listen to the person who's lived there for 17 years. And so my values, the way that I see and understand my place in the world, are shaped by the community from which I arose, right? As most PhDs, I worked hard for my hood, but I'm a product of my hood. Knowledge production, for me, is embodied and informed by the material conditions of my upbringing. So the oral narratives that I weave together to tell this story of Chicago footwork are themselves sufficient, flat out. but I have become a migrant of sorts, right? Geographically as well as intellectually. And so what I'm presenting reflects my commitment to sort of bridge both worlds, just as this symposium has done to better understand, the systems and the practices that have prevented us from, having safe and equitable and just and sustainable communities. So, with that said, I'm working on this documentary on Chicago footwork, right? It's called Footwork Saved My Life, The Evolution of Chicago Footwork. It's a 5-part docuseries on the art form and culture, and it, really saved my life. But what's interesting is that my co-producer was not here, and my primary cinematographer are from Dayton. Violet here is on the team, right? She's from Dayton. And I should also mention that the film came about because of the manuscript that I'm working on Chicago Footwork, which is ironically titled Chicago Footwork, Reimagining Community and Interrogating the Politics of Home. Did you know that?
I think so, because I think we came up with the title together.
So, do y'all want to see a snippet?
Yeah.
Yes.
All right. Say less.
Chicago known for its pizza, but when you from the hood, like Chicago is about footwork.
The origins of Chicago footwork actually go far as back as stepping.
Looking at my college culture, looking at dance culture, looking at Greek fraternity culture, stepping and all that, you watch how feet operate.
I saw Chicago Footwork and I was like, what is this? Like, somebody tell me what this is. Oh, that's footwork. You don't know what footwork is?
A freestyle and a battle dance.
It started on the west side of Chicago.
When it came to juke music or ghetto house, the music was slower.
When they sped the music up, that's when the moves changed.
We call that blind faith. It's either going to be a fad or it's going to be a cultural thing.
It's expression through music that we were pushing out.
I feel like when we do dance at that moment, we're connecting and having a conversation.
The DJ is good, but the dancing is what made it really stand out.
That one was serious.
Extreme, high energy, like 0 or 100.
The energy is different. It's aggression.
Every man for himself. You gotta get in that circle.
Meaning you'll have some heavy hitters in the circle, and they'll come in, and you will have a whole speaker rocking with footworkers.
There's no worries. Whatever's going on in life, it ain't in the circle, it ain't there.
I dance from being hurt, so I dance different. Once the beat hit me, I let my feet do what it's supposed to do.
We supposed to be playing basketball. I'm sitting there doing moves till the ball gets past him. Hey man, get your dance in there. You get me like.
When I hear the music, I try to become the music. I'm painting a picture for the audience to see.
Even though I wasn't expecting to footwork, now I really can't see my life without it.
That's what helped me build a second family. If I ain't have it, they made sure I did, and I was straight.
It's something about the cold of Chicago. Not just cold weather, but cold politics. When you have white flight and you have a disinvestment or divestment of economics, and you still got these homes that's not being valued, you have a lot of activity.
We just lost a footworker to violence.
Whoever knew y'all to be mothers? True. Man, whoever knew my kids would still be alive.
Gang mentality, all that stuff. There's qualities in all of it.
All our spaces have been shut down. The culture and the community gaining revenue right under the city nose. So if the city can't control it, the city shuts it down.
All these different practices to keep Black folks from defiling white spaces, to keep them on the outskirts.
When you were growing up in the hood, you don't really think about the negativity so much, because it was way more good times than bad.
I put the passion on the floor. You gotta be dedicated to something, whatever you do.
The music actually saved us. It saved a lot of us.
Who knows what would have happened if none of us started this? If it saved your life, like it always has to be that outlet, because that's like the reason that we're still here.
I really slept, eat, shit for work every day.
Yet, we go back into our trauma lives right after.
Are you the good person that's destined to be a part of this culture that needs to go to Chicago and like stop somebody from killing themselves?
Thank you. It's been a long time coming. But my research is so interdisciplinary, so today I want to share interview clips and stories from the community interspersed with some theory, some African American literature, some rap music, to make the argument that Chicago footwork is an embodied language of resistance. I've been hearing folks talk about language all day, so I feel really at home in that sense as well. But it's an embodied language of resistance that illuminates the humanity of Black youth in Chicago and creates transformative spaces of belonging where unbelonging is a systematically determined reality, right? So first I want to tell you about the art form. I want to, just tell you a little bit about, the history of segregation in housing in Chicago. I might even dance a little bit. Depends on how my knees are feeling. But so Chicago footwork is a cultural formation birthed from repressive structures and practices that have routinely harmed and disadvantaged Black youth in Chicago. Although footwork is now a global phenomenon, it originated on the South and West sides, mostly in underserved Black communities. We're talking about within housing projects like, Stateway Gardens, the Ida B. Wells, Cabrini Green, K-Town, the Allgale Gardens, Robert Taylor Homes. This urban street dance is characterized by multiple combinations of fast-paced, improvised movements of the feet, while symmetrical hand gestures routinely complement the grotesque contortions of the footworking body. One of the most important elements of Chicago footwork is the circle, which you heard them talk about, where the battles happen, right? These intense rounds of matchups between rival groups or rivalries, right? Individual rivals. The dance is inseparable from its music, footwork tracks. Tracks are continuous loops of kick drums, claps, and bass lines, offset by hip-hop, R&B, and now Black gospel samples, but I wouldn't exactly count on Chicago footwork to get you into heaven. The tempo of footwork music is now played at 160 beats per minute. It's a subgenre that evolved from Chicago's house music scene in the 80s. From there, it morphed into what has now been defined as ghetto house in the 90s, which were sort of these sped up house music tracks with overlaying chants that reflected the everyday realities of living in the hood. From there, the music transitioned into juke music, which spanned the 90s and overlapped with the era of footwork tracks. So juke tracks are like these really secular chants over consistent loops of predictable claps on the 2 and on the 4.
Now shake, now bounce, now bob, now drop, now twerk, now work, now come on y'all, let's do.
So yes, you're juking. We finally arrived at footwork battle tracks spanning the late 90s through till now, defined by the 160 BPMs, syncopation, tension, and like this really heavy underlying bass. So in his September 2021 interview, Portland footworker and tracks maker Gold Rat here stated, quote, "The tension comes from the syncopation and the crazy patterns of the offbeat and the persistent energy," end quote. The patterns, he argues, quote, "don't make sense at first," end quote. He continued, quote, "The rumbling bass gives a broad playing field to dance and by extension of freedom to play with instead of being limited by the consistent claps heard in juke," end quote. So his coupling of geography, freedom, and mobility for me sort of runs analogous to the restricted mobility of footworking youth, who are the unfortunate inheritors of a long history of residential segregation in Chicago. Thus, the unpredictable sonic elements, right, that you just heard in that last one, and footwork tracks sort of permit footworkers whose bodies are otherwise physically confined to travel freely, right, even if it's like sort of a metaphysical travel. Birthed in 1985, Chicago footwork and I are the exact same age. I'm trying to do the math, it's mid-20s. We were both born into a city under siege by a ravaging crack epidemic and Reagan's subsequent war on black and brown communities. Certainly crack would nestle in the bosom of a city already plagued with decades of systematic segregation, black crime and carnage concentrated in the south and west sides of the city, and white wealth and opportunity siloed primarily in its northern and suburban quarters. While I was the product of a middle-class South Side neighborhood, my community wasn't immune to the violence or gang life. When I came of age, Mayor Richard M. Daley had begun his plan for transformation, allegedly designed to demolish the public housing projects and integrate its inhabitants into diverse mixed-income communities dispersed throughout the city, right? But the consequences were dissipated gangs that relocated in communities like mine. Fortunately, life offered me two divergent pathways. My mother was an educator for Chicago public schools for 25 years. And my late father was one of the most renowned pharmacological Renaissance men in Chicago in the 80s until his demise in 1991. I was quite literally born into probably the biggest drug cartel in Chicago history, right? So for the first 5 years of my life, the primary source of income for my family was keynotes, from keynotes to keynotes, right? Kind of lame, but I blame for him. He told me to show up with my full self today. But, ultimately, I chose the road seldom traveled for many black youth in my city. Chicago Footwork would help determine my trajectory. Footwork was instrumental in compelling me to heed Nancy Reagan's admonition to steer clear of the drugs that their administration had so kindly gifted our neighborhoods. So if anything was stepped on by me, it was the ground beneath me from all the footwork that consumed my social settings in the late 90s and early 2000s. And footwork also allowed me to all but escape the vice grips of an unrelenting gang culture. That's my best friend, one of them. To echo Chance the Rapper, I love my city. We walk on eggshells and landmines. We communicate with hand signs. He's right. For the most part, I twisted my fingers to represent my battle cliques, the lunatics, in the tunnel. I terrorized circles rather than communities, all right? Like I was like really that deal in the circle. Unbeknownst to me, Chicago Footwork would eventually deposit me onto all types of stages such as this one. Footwork saved my life. Chicago Footwork was our hood Peter Parker. Despite casting a wide safety web across 5 generations, Chicago Footwork has been dismissed as a lowly art form birthed from some of the most crime-ridden neighborhoods and performed by black youth presumed to be the city's menaces. But criminal activity is often a byproduct of living conditions. Like hyper-segregated Dayton, Chicago is historically a poster child city for federally backed segregation policies. And the effects have been far-reaching. Still, Chicago ranks among the highest in black and white homeownership disparities for metropolitan cities, with 35% of black households owning their homes compared to 54% of white households and 43% of Latinx households. My family has a complicated relationship to Chicago's history of housing. And that's money in my grandfather's hand, and that's a table with 2 things that he's throwing around. So, despite his 7th grade education and very humble beginnings, my grandfather, Walter Bloodheim, managed to become one of the most memorable and well-respected black philanthropists and catalysts for economic uplift on the South Side. Growing up, I loved being Blood's granddaughter. I vividly remember all the admiration and respect, that he garnered all throughout the South Side. All right. So I would ride with him as he proudly identified every piece of brick and mortar that he ever owned on 79th Street and elsewhere. The list seemed to stretch into infinity. The Tiger Lounge, Flukey's Lounge, the Tiger Car Wash, Sean and Don Motel, Sean and Don Liquors and vending. And then there were the juke joints, where groups like the Temptations, the Shy Lights, the Dells, rhythm and blues singers frequented, where spectacles involving arithmetic and money abounded, where storytelling and signifying were nightly rituals, and where the underground policy world made possible above-ground survival of government policies. In this underground world, I've come to understand that black folks were free to be black at a crucial time in America when white supremacy was just being refined, when the conflation of blackness and non-citizen was finally beginning to unravel. Beyond the businesses and the creation of an underground world of belonging, my grandfather purchased home after home for black people who were locked out of home owning opportunities. I recently learned that he purchased a total of 12 residential properties between 1964 and the 1980s for various family members who had either been evicted or who couldn't get homes because of this sort of racially inequitable policies. It's easy to think of his story, right, from some neoliberal Horatio Alger's rags to riches lens. In fact, when I first learned of Mrs. Leela Francis, right, and the role that she played in desegregated communities like Oakwood and Dayton, I instantly thought of my grandfather. Their intentions and the outcome of their efforts, roughly 300 miles apart, somewhat parallel one another. But to be fair, my grandfather's story can't exactly be romanticized. His is a story about how a black man decided to use his business acumen, perfected by a hustler's mentality, to challenge racist segregationist policies that kept black folks confined to the slums and outside of quality dwelling spaces. But that's only part of it. What's sobering is the fact that he never received a direct bank loan for any of the properties because he himself constituted a high-risk borrower. In fact, to purchase his first home for his family, my granny, my mom, and my aunt, at 7731 South May, he paid a white man named Ed Truman, who secured an inflated mortgage before deeding the house to my grandfather. The mortgage man, my grandfather calls him, just the other day actually. Truman may not have been a recognized speculator, by definition, but I think the conditions that necessitated his role as middleman were the same nonetheless. A month after they moved in on May, what do you think happened? Their white neighbors to the east of them moved out. Then my grandfather purchased our family's second and last home in the up-and-coming middle-class Chatham neighborhood in 1971. It's pictured here and tattooed on my forearm because it houses every childhood memory of mine. He paid a large sum in cash, even though he should have had access to home loans, right? Because the Fair Housing Act had been passed, 3 years prior? Only a few years after moving on 83rd, Chatham was an all-black community, and this is still the case. Actually, my neighbor just called me the other day, or maybe about a month ago, telling me yo, it's white people jogging in the neighborhood. It was a big thing. And so my mother went to investigate it. Come to find out, the house on the end is Airbnb. On the end of the block, it's it's an Airbnb, right? So it's a dirty game. That's a quote from my grandfather from the other day. He began to realize that even he was victimized by the de jure and the de facto racial segregation policies. Further, the drill music scene in Chicago has taught the world about the 300 guys, only the family crew, turf wars between different factions of black disciples, and rapper Lil Durk's upbringing in crime-infested Inglewood. Lil Durk's whole career has been predicated on the lived realities of growing up in the Inglewood community in Chicago, where black-on-black murder rates are off the charts. Now, Inglewood does have some of the highest rates of violent crime, and so is #1 on our mayor's list of most prioritized communities for violent crime reduction. The violence in Durk's music, it's not metaphoric. So you can imagine how disturbed I was to see this video of the NCAA championship. What is it? I stole this from the internet. All I can really say is I hope I get the opportunity to take Miss Olivia Thompson to Inglewood. But Inglewood's resident, that was number 0. Inglewood's resident and home equity champion Tanika Johnson recast the narrative of Inglewood, forcing us to also consider not merely how black boys terrorize this community, but also how the community has been preyed upon by a different set of thugs, banks, speculators, realtors. You might already know about her folded map project, but her Inequity for Sale museum exhibit was an installation of markers placed outside of 12 to 15 homes in Inglewood, where at least 100 of the 75% of black families in Chicago in the 50s and 60s were robbed of their right of home ownership through land sale contracts. Many were evicted from their homes that the predatory speculators lured them into, right, and their accomplices, affecting generations of homelessness, poverty, and violence. As Richard Wright metaphorically depicted or allegorically depicted in Native Son, folks who are caged in their communities become animalized, behaving like rats that strike out in a panic frenzy, right, at the moment that they are pinned and cornered. So if we are menaces, Hoover, Roosevelt, Nixon, Clinton, the Daily Machine, HUD, the FHA, are all our Frankensteins. They molded us from the clay of their restrictive policies and practices. Many footworkers across generations have shared with me their awareness of the fact that wealth is funneled into predominantly white spaces, the gentrified Loop and downtown Chicago, while vacant lots, liquor stores, and fried chicken chains like Harold's Chicken, litter the South Side and the West Side. Consequently, the government and its agents have effectively curtailed the movements of Black folks and the spaces that they are allowed to inhabit. Westside Footworker Steps discussed making the best out of the limited radius of his existence.
In this area, it was so secluded for me. Like, I only knew this area. Yeah, my elementary school straight down here. So it's like elementary school here, my high school straight down here. It's just Austin High School. So it's like both of these community schools. So it's like when you from here, walk there, and so drop my sisters off at school and walk down here to this way. So it's like I have no choice but to be like, I gotta make this my domain. Like, I'm very known with it.
Also, Footworker and /DJ Sir Timo described how footworkers' bodies have a physiological and a kind of kinesthetic response to being confined to the spatial configurations of Chicago.
I noticed that the way that our houses are shaped in our community, the space within the houses, the fact that all of the houses are bunched up, that's prison. When you look at the project buildings, when you look at the row houses, it's house on house on house on house on house. This is all one cage. And you have all of these different mentalities basically locked in this cage, fighting for survival, fighting to find some type of place to get out. We boxed in the hood, it's closed in. That's the intimate part. It's very intense. All of the energy is focused right in here. It's like the eye of the storm, like a tornado. We're doing all this. The whole round.
For Timo, the battle circle, another enclosed space, is where we release the tensions of our imprisoned bodies. During the panel discussion that I moderated last fall at UMass, Creations Paul's Eddie described downtown Chicago as a distant unreality for him, even though it was in the direct line of vision from his Marshall Field Gardens high-rise project on the north side in which he grew up. Can you shed light on what it was like to learn how to footwork in Chicago, to grow up in Chicago as a Black boy and then Black man, right? And then how did footwork become the sort of hood Peter Parker for you?
Starting off, I was a street person. I made a lot of bad decisions, but I was smart. I had super hard-working parents, so I was reminded every day to do the right thing. That's just simple as that. So I moved smart. Even though I was in the street, I was a leader. I always been a leader. That's just how it's been. I saw my mama get up every day, like 3, 4 a.m., like go to work. You know what I'm saying? My pops get up, go to work. He set an example for me every day. This is when I didn't know what I wanted to do. You know what I'm saying? I was just playing sports, but I still was locked in the streets. In the area I used to live in, which is Marshall Field Gardens, well, OG is from, we used to have a view on our block where we could see the Sears Tower, but I never went downtown. All of those years that I stayed in the projects, we could see the view as far as the tower, but I never went downtown. And that little, it might seem very small with what I'm saying, but that's so big because in Chicago, there's a lot of people that never go out of town. First time I went out of town, literally, was with Charles and J. Ron. My family never traveled. When my parents moved out of the projects and we went to the South Side, that's how I caught on to footwork.
Growing up, the South Side's radius was my orbit. This video was literally my first time in Millennium Park in downtown Chicago, and we were only there to film B-roll. Like, black guy right there, that's my other film partner from Dayton. I felt out of place still. I was hyper aware of my body, my black body, footworking in an exclusionary space that the South and West Siders probably only visit in March and April when tax refunds hit. I felt assaulted. I wasn't physically harmed, but to echo philosopher Frantz Fanon, I could feel the piercing white gazes dissecting and objectifying my being, my footworking body, which bore all the traces of inner city abject blackness. I wondered, is this the case for most inner city black youth who traverse the red line boundaries that define their existences? How likely is it that a holistic and a human sense of who they are will not be confiscated from them and then handed back as some subhuman distortion? The white gazes are admonishments for daring to travel beyond the boundaries designed to cage us. Just this week, my grandfather recalled the construction of the Dayton Expressway under Mayor Richard J. Daley, which enclosed black residents among the State Street public housing units, widening the chasm that separated white and black communities on the South Side. At the time, in the 50s, he lived at 4494 South Wentworth in an apartment. He remembers that he was forced to relocate when the construction began. The tenant above him, Mrs. Everett, forcibly moved to a property on Wells, assuming that she was outside of the intended construction site. Once the highway was completed years later in '62, Mrs. Everett was displaced again. Black folks were shuffled around like objects to satisfy the social needs and economic conveniences of white developers. In an interview, the low-end legend DJ Clint recounted having grown up in the 90s in Chicago public housing projects located on the low end of Chicago, South Side, near the Dan Ryan, 30 years following the construction of the highway, in an era of racially charged attacks on black youth who transgressed the Wentworth Street dividing line. On the other side was the predominantly white Bridgeport neighborhood, which housed the then Comiskey Park Stadium, home of the White Sox, and the family of Mayor Daley. DJ Clint lived within Chicago's Black Belt, known for its concentrated, at least sociologists, concentrated poverty, crime, and gang culture. But Mrs. Henrietta would tell you that there's more there, right? There was. Although DJ Clint was fortunate to travel beyond these conditions, most of his peers were not.
So like Deion used to come out with these tapes called Sox Park Line, and they were the rap mixes. They played all hip hop, right? But Sox Park is Comiskey Park in that time. Before it became Guaranteed, Great Fit, and all of that, it was called Comiskey Park. And that would symbolize the low end, you know what I'm saying? So like, it was one point in time that we couldn't go to Bridgeport. And it's documented murders where they killed kids that went over there, black kids that went over there. So all this music was made, like we were our own entertainment. We couldn't go nowhere. Like it was boundaries set up, invisible boundaries set up in the city of Chicago. The red line is a boundary / Dan Ryan Expressway. That's a boundary. All of the freight trains that's going around these certain neighborhoods are boundaries. You know, now everything is kind of blurred, but back then you couldn't go in these certain neighborhoods because you'll get beat up or possibly killed. You know what I'm saying? It was rough. So with all of that, you know what black people do with struggle? We invent some shit. We create. We do something that's gonna give us some enjoyment, some fun. And it's so crazy because like a lot of these people didn't shop nowhere outside of Bologna. We didn't go nowhere. Well, I did. I was blessed because my mom, we went everywhere. But a lot of my friends never even been downtown in the 90s.
The venal policies of the housing market had dehumanizing outcomes for black and brown folks. The best rapper in the world once rapped, you know why they call a project? Because it's a project, an experiment. We're in it, only as objects. These lyrics have always evoked images of public houses used to warehouse black bodies like they were manufactured goods. Or, like my granddaddy and Mrs. Everett, we can argue that systematic segregation is dehumanizing because black bodies were mere chess pieces that were dislodged for the sake of commercial enterprise. In The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein confirms the relationship between housing and black humanity. He begins by arguing that residential segregation violates the 13th Amendment. Yeah, it abolished slavery, but in 1866, quote, Congress enforced the abolition of slavery by passing the Civil Rights Act, prohibiting actions that it deemed perpetuated the characteristics of slavery. Actions that made African Americans second-class citizens, such as racial discrimination in housing, were included in the ban, end quote. although the Supreme Court basically said, yeah, right, in 1883, I agree that denying African Americans access to decent houses reimposes the guises of slavery, and by extension, reduces black folks to objects, to control variables in racist experiments, into the category of the subhuman. But how have we fought back? In Ralph Ellis's Invisible Man, his nameless narrator grows tired of being defined by the prescriptions and the experiments of the outside world. The novel begins with Invisible Man's descent into his manhole, which is illuminated by the 1,369 lights that he's stolen from the power company. Invisible Man smokes his reefer and he listens to Louis Armstrong's How Does It Feel to Be So Black and Blue on his sonogram. The music facilitates an even further descent into this sort of contemplative region that allows him to reflect on the subjugated realities of black folks in America. But in this underground space, Invisible Man can self-define. Like my grandfather's juke joints, black expressive culture illuminates his humanity in the face of what he understood to be misrecognition. Likewise, literary scholar Caretha Mitchell has coined the term homemaking, which involves carving out these sort of regenerative spaces of possibility. In a similar line of thought, in his first novel, The Water Dancer, Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the world of the slave quarters the down there. And in our down there, I argue that homemaking is what allows footworkers to sort of go beyond their captive realities. In an interview with Ibram Kendi, Coates explains that, quote, living in the down there yields a certain insight and an enlightenment and a freedom and democracy that you can't get without actually being down there and living in it, end quote. As his protagonist recalls, this freedom is rooted in African-American cultural expression and oral history, quote, I marveled at the bonds between us, the way we shortened our words or spoke sometimes, with no words at all, the shared memories of corn shuckings, of hurricanes, of heroes who did not live in books, but in our talk, an entire world of our own hidden away from them. And to be a part of that world, I felt even then, was to be in on a secret that was in you. Those who have found Chicago footwork culture in the down there, in our metaphoric manholes during interviews, have admitted to me that it was also a regenerative space, that a world of new possibilities opened up for them, right? There was probably a lot of reefer smoking in their manholes. At the end of the earlier DJ Clint clip, Clint sort of alludes to homemaking, to harnessing Chicago's ghetto house culture to transform his realities. His descent into the down there spared his life and afforded him the opportunity to become one of the most trailblazing DJs of Chicago ghetto house juke footwork culture to this day.
The 90s, it was like up until maybe like 98, 97, the whole low end was pretty much GD. So I would just walk from project to project to project, going from party to party to party, and really wouldn't have to worry about nothing. When 98 hit and the BDs came and started flipping different buildings and whatnot, it wasn't as safe no more. But I still walked through because they had said, oh, that's the DJ, he just DJ'd last weekend, so I was safe. I've got it going, I ain't gonna lie now, I've been in a situation where I probably wouldn't be here right now. I was walking through the IDB rails coming from 35th from the Walgreens, me and my buddy Chevelle. We was just talking about this the other day. We were on our way back to Lake Park, and we cut through the Dearborn, the Deaf Homes, which is the Darrow Homes, what we call them the Deaf Homes. He was in the IDB rails. We was walking through there, and next thing you know, who the fuck is that? And there was a gauge on a 12-gauge shotgun, and the beam was pointed right at my chest, and there was another beam pointed on Chevelle's chest, and my hands was up like this with a pack of tapes in this hand, and my regular hand straight. And they're like, who is this? And I'm like, man, it's Clint, it's DJ Clint. Oh man, he cool, that shorty that DJ for us. And I was safe.
Gang turf wars and violent crimes such as snipers at the type of high-rises, the murders of children like Dantrell, all of this kind of stuff was happening. That was happening in Chicago, in Chicago public houses in the 90s, was so bad that it shaped the national discourse on the state of public housing in this era, where gang culture and the Daily Machine immobilized young black bodies in public housing east of the Dan Ryan. Chicago Footwork permitted free travel for Clint, or at least from project to project at this time. Clint was safe because just as Invisible Man turned his sonogram in his manhole, which like a lot of scholars have actually argued was akin to like a a DJ turntable. Clint made use of his Boss 600 drum machine and his Roller JS30 sampler, I have no idea what any of that is, and made a name for himself. He was the rose that emerged from the literal concrete. In several past interviews, he described using the concrete walls of his project building, 3939 Lake Park, which changed the sound of the claps and the bass in the music. These sonic elements, birthed from the bricks of spatial segregation, ricocheted all throughout the 39th Street project parties in the 90s, revolutionizing Chicago ghetto house music culture. Most of his now globally known tracks like Third World, Bounce, and Back Up Off Me were created within the Down There. In the world of the Down There, we are the developers, the architects, the realtors. Footwork was not cultivated at Juilliard. In my generation especially, footwork was incubated in our rundown skating rinks, in molded basements, and back alleys, and dim garages, and drab field houses, and dilapidated storefronts. These were our sacred and safe underground spaces. Most footworkers call these spaces home because theirs were volatile or non-existent. In our underground homes, we speak a common language, an embodied language of resistance. That is, we harness Chicago footwork to interpret and give voice to our individual and collective experiences when normative modes of subversive expression weren't available to us. See, language is important because it has the power to exclude folks, from communities, from border communities, right? If we think about, language requirements of naturalization tests, and from the human community. I've identified 3 different ways in which footwork has become an embodied language for us, allowing us to reclaim our humanity. Right? So here's a quick example of the first one, storytelling. During an interview, Havoc's Prince J-Ron explained how he's used footwork to tell stories, specifically to document the random acts of brutality that he and others who look like him have experienced in Chicago.
I was at home, cleaning, sweeping, wiping the windows, taking out the trash. On my way to go drive to the party, cops pulled up with their gun, telling me freeze, but yet they wanted to put me in cuffs. I didn't do anything. All I wanted to do was footwork.
He's good. Like Invisible Man, the descendants of the manhole opens up another space for us to reflect on our subjugated realities. Our stories aren't corn shuckers and hurricanes, right, in the Midwest 20th and 21st century world, but ours are instead stories of abuses of the state, as J-Ron makes clear. And then this is my homie, I'm not going to tell you his name because I'm not a snitch, but this is, well, I almost said it, but he's challenging state-sanctioned violence through his body, right? So Chicago footwork is a language of the body, right, that challenges multiple kinds of state-sanctioned violence. This was downtown Chicago in the summer 2020, when protests erupted in response to Ahmaud Arbery, and even like the verdict of, I think, if I remember correctly, Laquan McDonald. And the third one is, it's a language because it's a gateway for everyday, nonverbal, communicative exchanges. So to bring this thing home, I still got a ways to go though. I want to examine how Chicago footwork allowed for us to reclaim our humanity through our creation of this embodied language of resistance that we found in the Down There. I've already offered the example of storytelling. Now I offer examples using footwork as a response to state-sanctioned violence and as a means of engaging in everyday social interaction. So this is where the theory comes in. I'll try my best to explain it. And maybe I'll dance a little bit to break things up. Is that okay?
Hey.
So beyond the obvious, the issue for me with calling Black youth in Chicago any variation of the subhuman is that the label doesn't account for the forces and conditions that produce their said subhumanity. Those I've discussed are the legal reimposition of slave status of Black folks, right, through racial segregation, the animalizing effects of cage-like structures, the social scientific intervention of warehousing Black bodies for profit, the white gaze's objectification of those who transcend their geographical boundaries. So it's like, how are you gonna call me subhuman when your policies and practices have stripped me of my humanity, right? My other objection is that the criteria for determining the human, as posthumanists and disability scholars have argued, is sometimes defined based on like these really narrow ideas of what it means to be human. For instance, in the West, specifically in the US, right, verbal language is the mark of what it means to be human, right? The argument is that verbal speech sort of transmits our conscious thoughts, right? Which signifies our humanness. But also in the U.S. or in the West, full humanity is conferred to those who have mastered standard American, or in the U.S. mostly, standard American English, right? In written and verbal form, thereby achieving this high level of conventional literacy. But also, you're human if you're a fully functioning body that lacks any disabilities, right? Physical or cognitive. So, those are the arguments anyway. But what's often left out of the conversation is that disability and what queer and geopolitical theorist Jasmine Poir calls DAbility, which I'll explain, but she says that these things can result from multiple forms of state violence. Following Poir, I argue that the state and different repressive powers both disable and debilitate Black youth in Chicago. As a result, they make them into these perceived disfigured versions of humanity, right? In her book, The Right to Maim, she argues that DAbility is sort of, let me see if I can explain this. So it's this sort of, it's a difficult book, right?
It's hard.
So DAbility, right, is this kind of slow death, right? For these disposable populations, which is this slow wearing down of populations. It's not to orient you toward death, it's to kind of, she says, it's to maim you, right? So we're not gonna, kill millions of people in gas chambers, right? It's because we need their captive labor. We need their labor, but we are gonna maim you, as she puts it, or debilitate you, if that makes sense, right? So this means that debilitated populations are those that are expected to be able to endure pain and injury, right, and suffering. Hence why they are the targets of this kind of sort of ongoing wearing out or making available for injury, as Poir argues. Also, debilitation depends on structural inequalities, right? Because the goal is to keep you as a captive laborer, right? So I can wear you down because you may be confined to these spaces that don't have medical services and intervention and other sort of life-preserving provisions. So in the context of racial segregation in Chicago, here's an example of how the state / city disables and debilitates Black folk. During his interview, Footworker Mad Dog raved about having had to breathe the environmental toxins from the nearby landfills while growing up in the Altgeld Gardens housing projects. We were reminded by one UIC professor's interviewee, Dr. David Stovall, that the EPA declared the land on which the garden sits as having the highest concentration of toxicity in the country. As reported by the Natural Resources Defense Council in a 2017 article, quote, "The community had the highest rates of cancer in the city, along with scary rates of other illnesses related to exposure to substances," end quote. In the 90s, the EPA located, quotes, "elevated levels of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, pesticides, and heavy metals in the soil," end quote. So breathing these toxins resulted in Mad Dog's chronic asthma and exacerbated his mother's heart condition, leading to her death. Mad Dog's mom was disabled as the state never intervened to preserve his mother's life, right? But this kind of sort of hackneyed biopolitical, so which means like for the powers that be to let live and let die, right? Poir would argue like that's not comprehensive enough, right? We need to triangulate that. Because what about the fact that Mad Dog is maimed, right, and is sort of keeping on? She then therefore would argue that for Mad Dog, his chronic asthma is indicative of DAbility, or again, maiming of racialized groups so that they can be exploited in the interests of the economic interests of the state and its institutions. So I argue, and part of argue this part, that Mad Dog is understood to be a disfigured young Black male body, and so outside of the realm of humanity. Mad Dog's recourse was to harness Chicago footwork as a language to critique environmental racism a year ago, he won a prestigious grant for which he used to choreograph a film titled Footwork Through the Trauma. The piece that he performed live last year was titled Shortness of Breath. It begins with the footwork routine and ends with the poem, right, that examines growing up in the gardens and the many generations of family members who perished from cancer and mostly respiratory health issues, in particular COPD, congestive heart failure, and asthma. He talks about how Big Pharma made a killing on pharmaceuticals like prednisone and albuterol, on which he relied for 12 years. In this sense, his family members were disabled and then killed while he was sort of debilitated for profit. He intentionally recites the poem following the full performance to reify his reality of having had to navigate his community and footwork always out of breath. Now this is the part that I'm not looking forward to.
Hey, we are.
These are y'all rude boy. Back up off.
Shortness of Breath by Mad Dog. This works every time. Footwork through the trauma. Footwork through the trauma. I can't breathe just like my mama. My mother always told me that I was shortened of breath. She said, baby, I'm sorry that at times you can't breathe. Told me it was all because I was born in the gardens, a polluted Allgill Gardens, where waste management shows total disregard for black. Right across the street from my garden, where they burn the city's garbage and waste, and pollution runs through our water pipes right into your Kool-Aid. Imagine being born into a family where nobody can breathe, prednisone and albuterol inhaler your best friend. When you ride past the 131st Street exit on the Bishop Ford, you can smell the stench of black asthma. Asthmatic cancerous death. Every person in my family shared that fate. In 2018, my mother died from congestive heart failure and was on 24-hour oxygen for 11 years. Every time I dance, I'm reminded of the environmental racism that has happened to me and every family member in Allgill Gardens. I know one day I will share the same fate as my mother, but I'm going to footwork through the trauma. Footwork through the trauma, but I can't breathe just like my mama. I love Mad Dog, really appreciate that. In critiquing the violence of the state, primarily through the language of Chicago footwork, Mad Dog reconstitutes himself as a citizen subject of the state with endowed rights. He underscores the state's obligation to him and to others like him. So the counter argument, well, we give rights, to animals too. This is true, but in the tradition of social contract theory, political subjects are human beings. So this is the second example. This is my final example. I'm good? Okay. I went too fast, sorry. My final example is of reclaiming humanity, I'm still tired, by harnessing Chicago footwork as a language in everyday social exchanges, right? But so let me unpack the argument. So this one is kind of convoluted. So, all right, young black folks in the city have also been deemed subhuman because they lack the capacity of language, a particular kind of that, standard white English. As Parr argues, quote, the inability to communicate functions as a significant determinant of mental or cognitive impairment, right? So can't communicate, it constitutes mental and cognitive impairment. And then those who are cognitively disabled are often not recognized as fully human. I return to Parr again because she wants to, quote, destabilize privileged modes of communication, right? So how we speak, she doesn't think that verbal language should be the primary means of communication, right? So however, what she wants to do is sort of disrupt this human-animal binary, which I'm not trying to do right now, at least, because I know that in some contexts like that makes sense to me. For instance, disability rights scholars and activists will say, well, for those with physical disabilities, their existences are mediated through and by objects, right? So we shouldn't deny someone humanness on the basis of their object status. So I agree with that. Parr believes in multiple kinds of ontology or being outside of human beings, right? And argues that this isn't a viable possibility. So it isn't a viable possibility for us to look at this continuum and say, being is, objects, it's non-human species, etc., right? But she says we can't do this if we don't recognize that language is multiple and does not merely belong to human beings, right? So which can then allow human beings to say that we are superior to animals. So at this juncture in history, black folks are denied rights and killed because we are considered to be subhuman. So until the world agrees on and codifies into law a broader category of the human, right, that includes other species and objects, right, so I can't just jump on that bandwagon right now. I mean, shit, look at corporate personhood, right? But, so I want to borrow from Poir's solutions, though, for moving away from privileged modes of communication. Because I do want to locate black footworkers on the human side of that human-animal divide by proving Chicago footwork to be an embodied form of communication. This means that even if black youth have not mastered standard white English, that they have other means of communicating and expressing themselves, and are so actually not cognitively impaired, and by extension, or in an absolute sense anyway, right? And by extension, sort of perverted versions of the human. But it must first be acknowledged that city officials and the Chicago public school system have created the conditions of perceived cognitive disabling of black and brown youth in Chicago. That is, if we pivot from this argument that conventional literacy is what allows legible modes of communication. Poir argues, quote, targeting youth not for death, but for stunting, for physical, psychological, and cognitive injuries is another aspect of a biopolitical tactic, and that it constitutes debilitation and maiming. So a lot of sociological scholarship and discourse on housing and education, you all know this already, including redlining, mapping, inequality in Dayton and Springfield, which you probably saw yesterday, right, informs us that housing and poverty and education are interlocked institutions. If property taxes determine the quality of education in communities, then the education of black and brown kids, many of whom occupy rental properties in the slums, will pale in comparison to their white peers in white-dominated home-owning markets. Oh, went too far. Okay. So, according to Illinois policy.org, right? So I'm not going to read the stats, but let's see. Many CPS students do not meet or exceed literacy standards. Chicago has some of the lowest performing schools, and most of these low performing schools are located in the inner city, and so are populated by black and brown kids, many of whom are footworkers. After decades of consistent high illiteracy rates, Illinois is just now considering literacy reform with the passing of the Right to Read bill to address the literacy crisis. There are only 12 states as of earlier this year that haven't passed literacy reform bills. Chicago is just now responding to its illiteracy crisis, if the Senate passes. In the intro track to his PTSD album, Chicago drill rapper G Herbo raps, real menaces. We grew up like Dennis's, huh? Play with pistols, we ain't had no Sega Genesis, No curriculum, can't punctuate our sentences, so no. Niggas supposed to be on prom doing sentences. Y'all hear Herbo's homonyms. Sentence and sentence, right? So these homonyms, they call attention to this causal relationship between low literacy levels and criminality. People say my boy can't rap. So complicating the low performance rate is the disinvestment in public education. Beginning in 2013, Mayor Emanuel closed 50 Chicago public schools, fertilizing the soil for gang and gun violence in Chicago. And then, under her regime, Mayor Lightfoot decided to repurpose some of those buildings, converting them into police training camps. Actually, that interview of DJ Clint that I did it at his mom's house with him and his son. And when I walked outside, I was trying to remember what high school was directly in front of his mom's house. He was like, it doesn't matter now, it's a police academy. Real story. This preoccupation with militarizing black communities rather than investing in cognitive development evidences a kind of naming by the sovereign state and a will to control and discipline vulnerable populations. Yes, the literacy crisis should absolutely be addressed, but this should happen through culturally competent and revamped literacy models, right? Such as what Carlos was kind of talking about last night if you attended his session. To be clear, many black students are illiterate, though, by state standards, which rely, again, on standard white English as the metric, and so are perceived to be cognitively impaired or disabled. Consequently, quote, bodies understood as disabled, in particular, cognitively disabled, have often been cast as inert passive objects rather than human subjects through a projection of degraded objecthood, elevated over qualified personhood. In other words, the alleged illiteracy of black youth renders them cognitively impaired objects to be acted upon. And the down there, Chicago footwork, however, engenders its own form of communal literacy. they or we have developed alternative forms of language to make ourselves intelligible to one another within institutions that perpetually misrecognize us. This alternative language system of the body makes possible the reclamation of our humanity by calling into question presumed cognitive impairment, right? But sort of buying into this argument, and to use footwork to help sort of substantiate Black humanity, to do so, we need to interrogate privileged and Eurocentric white supremacist modes of communication. So I'm using Poir again, her suggestions regarding the destabilization of, these normal ideas of what constitutes language. So first, she argues that we have to sort of get rid of the primacy of language as this absolute sign of communication. Well, I argue that we need to do away with the primacy of verbal language and reducing the importance of verbal language. Following Poir, we can sort of expand bodily capacity and that we begin to acknowledge multiple modalities of bodily articulations. And we can say that the body is articulating itself from multiple places, right? Example, ASL. Second, Poir argues that we must reconsider where language is even located on the body. So remember, she argues that language belongs to multiple species. Dolphins, for instance, speak through their nasal passages. Well, y'all should know where I'm going with this, right? In this same vein, Chicago footworkers are speaking through another part of the body, through the legs, which means youth in Chicago are not illiterate and so cognitively disabled in an absolute sense, and so passive objects, right? And so this can be seen in the following clip of Prince JaRon's experience of nonverbal embodied communication during everyday social interactions. And so just a little bit first before I show you the clip. So he's discussing coming up in the third generation of Chicago footwork. This is, before social media allowed you to sort of study your opponent. So he studied this legendary footworker who had been turned into an urban legend in the hood, right? By word of mouth though, because again, there was no YouTube, to like stalk folks. So, but JaRon knew this. JaRon knew what his signature moves were, and he talks about meeting him and sort of being able to identify him through these moves and battling him and using footwork as language, like as this linguistic exchange to get to know him. So we can't fast forward though? Oh, hold on.
Long story short.
It's not a long story short.
It happened a lot of times. And one legendary footworker, his name was BB, and I always heard about this dude. But he stopped dancing around the time that I got good. So basically in Chicago footwork, the whole point of the video game is you find a person that's good and you try to destroy them in front of a crowd of people so you can steal their rap. So it's like, you the king now, like you just took the juice. Basically that's what it is. So, I got approached at gas stations, in the bathroom, lunchroom, like, you're not safe if you that good. So
where King Charles told me a story about how he used to work at Popeyes. And,
yeah, they come to your job.
And they would come to your job and battle you on your job.
Yeah, literally, it's crazy. Everybody needs to respect it. The respect that comes with it is some genuine love, like Paul said. So this legendary dude named BB, the clues I had was he was an old school footworker. He's very a master at doing spins. And he's from a crew called Final Chapter, which I got a chance to meet one of the members. And so I was familiar with the style. They do a lot of stuff on their heels. So those was like some of the things. I didn't know how he looked, so I didn't have no description of hairstyles to look for. So basically I was doing an audition for one of my members that's amazing now, but at the time he sucked. But he was trying to join the crew, and I'm like, I don't know if I feel like working with this dude. But we didn't have dance studios, so our practices was in the middle of a public street. Like when cars stop coming, all right, now we footwork. When a car comes, we stop footworking. So we're in the middle of the street having a battle. Basically, he's battling us to prove to us that he's worthy to be in our crew, to be trained. So while he's dancing, a car go past, pull over to the side, which is very usual. When you footwork in Chicago, it builds crowds. And the guy come out with a white t-shirt and just standing there looking like this. I'm not dancing. I'm just on the car letting my members test this dude out. But I'm watching the scene like, who is this dude? Oh, maybe it's just somebody that's spectating. All of a sudden, he tapped the person that's trying out as far as, because he didn't say no words. He didn't say hello. hey, what you guys are? Nothing, just quietly walked up, tapped the person, which was, don't dance, I'm gonna dance for you. Seriously, and he just started taking off. So we like, whoa, he know how to footwork. My younger members don't know anything of the stories that I know. So while he's dancing, I'm starting to see certain moves. I see him doing stuff on his heels. I'm like, okay, he's old school by the way he started off. That style looked like Spinal Chapter. But, so second round, he goes again. I'm noticing again, like, this dude, he's really good, but I could tell he hasn't been dancing in a while. But then I thought about it, and could this be that dude named BB? So I said, just said while he was dancing, I was like, hey, hit some spins. You can't do no spins. Without thinking, he just instantly was like, ooh. I'm like, oh, that's him. I didn't say anything. The only communication I had with him was hit some spins. Once I saw that, I moved my members out the way. Like, you're not ready for this dude. Like, this is a legendary dude named BB. Like, y'all have no idea what y'all in front of right now. This is greatness. So I started footworking towards him. Not in a disrespectful way, but in a greeting of, I'm from, he's battling newer footworkers. So in the style of footwork that we in now, is the younger the generation, the more tricks and all these big moves, less fundamental basics. So more old school generation, they have more fundamentals, which is the basics, like I was showing you. So, when I approached BB in a footworking way, as a greeting, I did foundation steps to show him I know my history. I was doing erg and jerks, running man, and he's nodding like, oh, you know what I'm saying? Like, he's not no just new school footworker that's doing all this breakneck and all this other crap that don't got nothing to do with the feet. But he was nodding, you know, and it's crazy because I got this like videotape. Like, it's crazy. I didn't know I was going to capture this whole footwork conversation with no words on tape. And so he's nodding while I'm dancing, as in the exchange of, I see you, I understand. You do know the old generation steps, but you also from the new school. And then he responded back with a welcome combo, like, I am BB, he did a spin. And then after he did it, then he shook my hand like, what's up, man? My name BB. I'm like, I already knew. I'm like, my name JaRon from Happy. He's like, man, I heard about y'all. I'm like, dude, I heard so much about you. It's like, I've been dancing since 2002 and I'm just now meeting you in like 2008. This is crazy. Like, yeah, it was dope. But the whole point of it is, it's a language and it's spiritually respected through long story short, it happened.
Okay, I told y'all it wasn't going to be a long story short, but so what we see is like how language is both located in this sort of wide gamut of bodily capacities, such as the ability to spin, right? What one can do with the feet, and not just in the matter of verbal speech. We also see this reappraisal of nonverbal language via embodied performance, which allows for privileged modes of communication to at least be decentered, because he does say something, right? Or repositioned as secondary, and then, you know, footwork communicates locality and generation and identity. In closing, I hope that you bear in mind that this art form, this culture began as, and is still the very lifeblood of Black survival in the city in which it came to be. The underground world, the down there, that we've carved out for ourselves is not unlike Ralph Ellison's narrator's manhole. Like Invisible Man, Black expressive culture, i.e. Chicago footwork, has illuminated our humanity in the face of misrecognition and debilitating structures. In the down there, we are no longer siloed appendages. Rothstein argues that segregated housing projects only further pack Black folks into high-rise ghettos where community life was impossible. Well, we can imagine community in the down there. We've erected our own governing structure, social norms, and system of language. We exist in the affirmative, although we, too, never lose sight of the negation of the world above us, for we do have to crawl out of those manholes, but we always return. We have no choice. Our bodies are linguistic vehicles, permitting unrestricted travel, metaphysical and otherwise, beyond our confined realities. As JaRon once admitted in an interview, quote, when I step inside the circle, my body just goes somewhere and I don't even know where, end quote. So we don't ask for inclusion in the down there where there are no bounds. If I may borrow again from Caretha Mitchell, Chicago footwork makes possible homemade citizenship. which is a deep sense of success and belonging that does not depend on civic inclusion and mainstream recognition. That was a quote. Well, the street that Prince J-Ron described wasn't necessarily off the grid, but they existed in their own sort of esoteric enclave. Neither J-Ron nor the legendary BB desired the translation of their embodied exchange to an outside audience. Their exchange was intelligible to one another. They both recognized each other as participating members in a cultural community across generations. That's homemade citizenship. We do, however, recognize that our obligation to critique the violences enacted upon our bodies in the world above us, as Mad Dog did, and we do not wish to remain disenfranchised in the world above us, for the land is our rightful inheritance, and we coming for it. As post-pandemic eviction rates climb in both Dayton and Chicago, we must seek out conventional and unconventional ways to resist. For us, in the down there, Chicago Footwork provides spaces of belonging, visibility, but also possibility.